Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you, the BBC makes a slight faux pas when they choose the wrong logo. We have a common drug that may be better than aspirin for heart attacks, although it's based on a singular study. A woman infected from rabies by cow, which is one of the more unusual vectors. Finland and Poland both consider flooding massive areas of peat bog to slow down the Russian advance, not quite understanding that Russia doesn't care about that. The human meat wall will just fill those essentially moats. The pit of ancient horrors may have been a victory celebration of the Slaneshi kind. A paper taking aim at various chatbots and LLMs. And the world will see a blood moon that'll last for nearly an hour and a half. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with the BBC and what is arguably the highlight of this week in terms of the most, let's say, pleasant news. They were presenting a topic quite a few years back now on, essentially the UN and Amnesty International. Unfortunately for them, they mistook the UNSC from Halo for the United Nations Security Council. The acronym may be the same, but the meaning differs significantly. One involves superpowers arguing over whether or not they're doing a terrible thing and often boycotting or avoiding the others. The other, again, is a cause of giant super soldiers and massive spaceships and interplanetary colonization. Clearly, they differ significantly. But at least it's more enjoyable, let's say, than much of the rest of the news we have for you this week. Moving now to common drugs, and particularly talking about aspirin. Aspirin is used as a very low-dose medication continuously to try and reduce the ability for blood to clot, thereby avoiding issues around heart attack and, for that matter, other similar diseases, like stroke and any infarct. Remember, if you have an infarct, you are in fact fucked. Well, possibly anyway, if you don't get it treated very quickly. The reason aspirin is used is because, as mentioned, it prevents blood from clotting, or at least reduces its ability to do so considerably. But some cardiologists think that a different drug may be considerably better. This drug is called clopidogrel, and it does exactly the same thing as aspirin. It stops blood from clotting, which, obviously, good. The only reason it's preferable, let's say, and is superior, is that it's better for those that have an established coronary artery disease. Basically, you have things like clots in your arteries, atherosclerosis, those sorts of things. The new drug, let's call it, is far less, particular about the sex, the body size, the ethnicity, everything else about the individual taking it, and therefore it's better. Now, you might be wondering how much better is better, and the answer is about 2%. Yes, this is not a huge improvement. It's better than not dying at all, and obviously 2% more people who aren't dead is good most of the time, but it's still a very subtle difference in those terms, and we would definitely argue that there doesn't appear to be the, necessary statistical significance in those terms. So, yes, cool results, but very, very, let's call it tenuous to start with. Moving on to other news that's going to also be rather contentious. Consuming red meat may help prevent cancer. This is, one of the more interesting arguments to come out recently because IARC, another part of the World Health Organization, has said that consuming processed meat will cause cancer, or at least is prone to doing so, much the same way that glyphosate is, but not quite as bad as alcohol. They have some weird views. If we ignore the dose and results argument, we can look at the fact that red meat consumption, according to the World Health Organization, is probably carcinogenic, according to them, but the new research by Canada's McMaster University says that's not the case. The difference between these two positions is that the World Health Organization, and specifically IARC, basically relies on, aggregating all of the existing research. They rarely do their own direct research. They're more like a giant meta-analysis machine, which is fine by itself. But the McMaster University is completely direct, it is novel, it is primary research. And so, we need to be mindful that there's a big difference in not necessarily the quality of the research, as all meta-analyses have to be considered on the merits of their actual quality, but also how substantial it fits into the wider body of literature. If this is a random puzzle piece from a different puzzle, and you try and insert it into whatever you're working on now, of course it doesn't fit, and therefore doesn't make any sense. So let's look at the actual research itself, let's say. First of all, the researchers do put all animal proteins together, and so as a result you need to be aware of the fact that, well, things like a fish do provide very different nutritional profiles to, say, beef, pork or chicken, or anything else for that matter. The second is that they may or may not have let's say, not adjusted for things like a dairy in your diet, wine, a fruit and vegetable intake, and so on. So there are a few issues around, let's say, confounding variables, to be kind about this. And of course, there is a arguable case for a conflict of interest in which the National Cattlemen's Beef Association was the primary funding body. Kind of helps to conclude that the thing that's funding you is good to get more funding. Generally works that way, that if they make more money because you said that they are good for you, they tend to want to throw more money at you to try and make their position better. The same way lonely sad men at the strip club at lunchtime will throw dollar bills at a stripper in an effort to make themselves feel better. It doesn't work either way. Both the stripper and the lonely sad man will remain lonely and sad, except the stripper will have a few more dollars to their name. The other aspect to this is that, as we mentioned, the IARC reports particularly call out processed meats, although they don't exactly do that very well. So some of their claims are that all meat is bad for you, some of them are more specifically processed meat is bad for you. This study doesn't discriminate between them. It says any meat will stop cancer, or at least reduce it. So this isn't so great, and it's a major weakness. The study also made claims that plant-based proteins, legumes, nuts, soy products, and similar, had no strong protective effect against cancer, or at least dying of it. Now, we think there's a little bit of semantics going on with that, purely because dying from cancer and being protected from cancer are not the same thing. So there may be some definite shenanigans going on with the conversation here, but the primary research is definitely worth a read and definitely interesting. Shifting now to what could be considered not quite a case study, but close enough, it tells us three things that are very important. First of all, apparently milking cows is incredibly dangerous, as you can get infected with rabies. The cows can get rabies, and that you want to be getting treated for rabies if you think you've been infected. The Times of India reports on this, and in short, a young woman was milking a cow that was infected with the virus, and from that she managed to become infected with rabies that had been infected into the cow, let's say, by a stray dog earlier the week, and just didn't get treatment. Obviously, this does not end well for anybody involved, because rabies is not fun. Well, it's not fun most of the time. We're sure that there is some exception to that rule, but as a rule, no, you don't want rabies. Moving on now to other, more specifically animal news, we have failures at a zoo, and specifically failures at a zoo that kept trying to breed some hyenas. Now, hyenas, when you're trying to breed them, can be quite challenging. First of all, a female hyena can develop what's called a pseudopenis. That is, their clitoris extends and grows so significantly that it is mistaken for a penis. As a result, we can somewhat forgive the work by a zoo that tried to breed two male hyenas for 4 years. But we would argue that any kind of work to check whether or not there were issues, say, with genetics or something similar that prevented them from reproducing should have picked up the fact that they had the same set of chromosomes. But no, they just kept on trying. So, next time you're living with, say, a housemate or a flatmate, or whatever you wish to call them, and you happen to be thinking, why aren't there any children around? I wonder if perhaps it's because you're the same sex, or you just haven't thought very hard about this. Now, for horses, and this may or may not, let's say, ride the people the wrong way. Yes, we'll keep up the terrible puns. You don't need to worry about that. They will come on, and keep coming, and coming. Much like a horse. The first gene-edited horses are entering the field of polo, and this is going to be very interesting to see what happens, because unlike humans, where there are definitely very clear-cut rules around the use of various drugs and performance-enhancing things, horses, there are rules about drugs, but there is definitely nothing to be said about, well, genetically modifying the horse to be a better player or better horse to ride in the match. These horses coming out of South America are, well, they look like just any other horse, and they do what every other horse does. They eat, and they look big, and occasionally they decide to make noise. This is a horse thing. We know much about horses, obviously. But these 10-month-old horses are the first that have been genetically modified, and because of this, they are, well, curious enough as it is. First of all, they are clones. So we have genetic modification, now we have cloning. All we're missing out for the trifecta of terrifying things is that they're somehow super horses. And that may actually be not necessarily the case, but getting much closer to. The company involved looked at trying to reduce the expression of myostatin, because what that does is limit muscle growth. Limiting muscle growth means you now have beefcake horses.
Beefcake! Beefcake!
Beefcake horses that will be able to shove, push, and otherwise get through any other horse, because they are, for all intents and purposes, getting very close to the deathcore of Krieg's steed, which is not really a horse at this stage anymore. Certainly was, but after modification, no. So this could be a very interesting case in terms of what the rules in polo have to say about the use of these horses, and to a somewhat lesser extent, whether or not the same sort of functionality in terms of genetics could be achieved through crossbreeding, selective breeding, and similar mechanisms that would mean that technically it's achievable without genetic modification, it's just a much slower and more difficult process. Going now to Europe, and specifically more environmental news. We have plans by both Finland and Poland to flood peatland or peat bogs. These are areas that, historically at least, have been full of water, mud, and similar. They are essentially your swamps from Florida. They're just like crocodiles, which that's also another thing they could solve by introducing it. The problem we have is that the plan is simply to do this to slow down Russian advances if Russia gets anxious about expanding its borders once more, or, as we continue to argue, Putin wishes to recreate the efforts of Alexander the Great. But the problem we have with this is that the areas that they're talking about flooding are not insignificant areas. They are massive areas of land. And, of course, massive areas of land need massive amounts of water to be flooded. And you can't just pump this full of seawater. It does have to be fresh water. So this means Finland and Poland both need enough fresh water to be able to flood them. They need to be able to sustain that flooding for, at a minimum, the duration of the Russian invasion, let's call it. And, of course, if all else goes at least somewhat to plan, assume that the wildlife, the housing, everything else that is there, doesn't just die with what is essentially a recreation of the great floods in the Bible, just on a much more localized scale, but certainly similar effects, killing everything that doesn't find itself on a boat. But it is theoretically a perfect solution, except for the fact that Russia will just send in more men, and they will make a bridge out of dead bodies. Going now to the UK and another part of Europe, but different news entirely, and this time it's part of a series of dumb news items we have for you. Dumb in that things just are silly. First of all, we have a lesson in why you should always have a safety Naruto. A safety Naruto is somebody who is dressed up as Naruto from the anime, obviously. But why you need someone like this around when you're doing cosplay is to avoid what this poor bastard had happen. They were arrested after being mistaken for a criminal. Now, we understand the UK has gone to pot recently, but we're still not convinced that it's normal for someone in the UK as a criminal to walk around in full Umbrella Corporation gear with a gun that has an orange cap on the end. Yeah. Now, the 16-year-old child was arrested for carrying an imitation firearm. So, having an imitation is now illegal, rather than having the real thing. The problem here is very simple. He was dressed up as Hunk, a mysterious faceless character from Resident Evil, who basically wears, well, tactical gear, a face mask, and carries around a small submachine gun. And this is all well and good, except for the fact that on his way to an anime convention, the authorities pulled him over and arrested him. This is one of the most dumb situations ever. Not just because it was kind of stupid to do this. You typically want to be better prepared when going to an anime convention and not have your weapons and things out in public unless you have no way of storing them practically. But more importantly, why did the police arrest him for having an imitation firearm? Literally, the issue we have here is that he did do something dumb, but the dumb does not warrant what happened afterwards. Going to other dumb news now, we have moves by RFK Jr. to try and get a journal to retract an article that not just proves he's full of shit, but in doing so, he's tacitly admitted that, yeah, he is completely wrong and wants to hide any evidence to the contrary.
That's a stupid idea.
What?
It's a stupid idea. You're a stupid man. A stupid man.
Ow! You're hurting me! Stop it! Stop it, Lois!
No, I'm so sick of your crap. Why do you always do these stupid things?
And it also very much undermines his bullshit report on vaccines and health. What we're talking about here is the Danish study into aluminium and other adjuvants in vaccines and autism. The study, after looking at the entirety of the population of Denmark and all of the various details contained within, which is a very long-term study, many children, and the dose response associated with that, they found that no, there's no association. RFKrayKray has asked the journal, can you retract this article because I don't like it and it hurts my fee-fees? The journal, admittedly surprisingly, politely said no, rather than doing what they should have done, which is just ignore it because it's a stupid request. But, well, this is a interesting scenario, let's say. Partly because, well, let's be blunt about it, RFKrayKray is trying to censure the literature to have it only support his point of view, which is not how science works. The only time you retract something that's been published is if there's some sort of misconduct, there is an egregious problem with the data, the methods are absolutely terrible and cannot be justified, or there is something similar showing that you actually can't trust what they've written, not because your feelings were hurt. And so, naturally, this led to, well, a bit of a kerfuffle, let's call it. Kennedy basically is wanting to have the world follow his wishes, and the world has turned around and told him, no, grow up and stop being a child, which has worked to some extent. In child-related news, we have at least novelty, in that, well, let's call it this. It was a creative interpretation of the rule regarding what is one cup. The, let's call it a truck stop, has banned a 9-year-old child because they understood that if your sign says, I can fill a cup for $1.49, then that means it is a cup, but you haven't defined a cup. So, in this case, the child brought their own large bin, and using the technicality of said bin was technically a cup, began trying to put 7 gallons, or approximately 28 litres of soft drink, into said bin. Peyton, the 9-year-old child, has now been banned, which is unfortunate because, well, why would he show remorse when he followed the rules? Admittedly, he followed the rules in the most creative way possible, but that's still following the rules, and technically correct is the best kind of correct. We now move on to an update to a much older news item, and that is the Ancient Pit of Horrors. It's basically a hole in the ground full of skeletons and various other remains that make clear that this was not a nice place to be, if you happen to be the non-winning side of things. The update shows that rather than just being a, let's say, grave site or a mass grave, as similar sort of things, instead, the various severed arms, broken bones, etc., that have all been mutilated and, let's say, treated in a very unpleasant way, may have just been, well, trophies. Weird and rather morbid trophies, but trophies. Analysis of the skeletons show that not only were they heavily mutilated in terms of being skeletons, but when they were alive there is a decent chance that they had their legs broken to prevent them from running away, and that based on the various holes and piercing marks that are shown, they may well have been strung up somewhere to be shown after they were dead, or possibly while they were being tortured. allowing the public to see what it's like to resist whatever the winning party was in this case. As a result, this is not just a pit of horrors, but an entire show. Archaeology is great, technology not so much, with Taco Bell having to essentially halt its rollout of AI after trolls have managed to fundamentally break it. The first issue they found was that the moment you put up any kind of automated system, somebody is going to try and test it. Now, theoretically, product testers are meant to be able to figure out all of these things beforehand, but the reality is that real-world testing and product testing are, well, worlds apart. And so what a product tester will do, no matter how good they are at their job, will never quite live up to the reality of what actual users will achieve. And in this case, 18,000 cups of water from an AI happened to break its mind.
You are an unusual specimen to so boldly walk into the mighty expanse of the think tank, fearless and proud as a teddy bear. Between the extraction of their higher reasoning abilities and urination-inducing fear, most lobotomites dare not approach us, let alone speak to us.
And you just don't know what humans are going to do when given the chance to be a troll. Sadly, this did not quite go the way of Tay AI, who turned into a Nazi and racist, but it's still kind of funny that they managed to break the AI there. Moving on to better, but still a long way off technology news, we have 6G, which will be interesting to see how the anti-vaxxers react to this, given that they think 5G is causing all sorts of grief. Engineers in China and the US have both demonstrated that a 6G chip not only exists, but that it can provide internet speeds of over 100 gigabits per second. At the moment, that's about 10 times faster than 5G's theoretical limit, and considerably more than that again for the average speed you get under 5G. The 6G network is not expected to see any kind of use until sometime in the 2030s, mostly because you still need a large amount of groundwork to be done, you need infrastructure, and you actually need a product line to be able to install. As a result, it's kind of interesting and definitely amazing if it works, but if it works is the big key here, is basically everything has just been a laboratory proof of concept. Which, yes, that's where you start, but a start is not a final product and certainly not available to be usable in any way, shape or form. So we'll wait and see what happens, but for now it's, unlikely to go anywhere. Moving to a very blunt analysis of LLMs particularly, we have claims that ChatGPT is bullshit, which is the most direct and reasonable heading we've seen for any kind of article in a long time. Not quite as good as the get me off your mailing list article, but this will do. The article as it's summarized here with the abstract is, well, exactly what it says. The article really particularly explores the fact that AI appears to be experiencing some kind of hallucination, leading to the production of weird, random, and crazy results that have no bearing on the actual reality of the situation. Shifting now to global news, and particularly the environment, but sitting somewhere between the environment and space. At the moment, due to satellite observations of Earth, the researchers have noticed that our seasons don't match up with our seasons. That is, the general and typical, let's say, progress of spring, summer, winter, and autumn, typically in that sequence to start with, but more importantly, matching to certain months of the year, depending on whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere, no longer quite lines up the way it should. And no, we're not referring to the same sort of thing your grandfather or even father, mother, grandmother, etc. might say, that as they were a child, the weather was never like this. No, we actually mean that there appears to be the change in these seasonal cycles based on what are partly hot spots and obviously inversely cold spots. This has led to a certain amount of asynchrony or lack of synchronization between what should be happening and what is happening based on the season and time of year. We should be clear, this research is somewhat limited because, first of all, it relies on about 20 years of satellite imagery, which in theory is great because that's a lot of data. The downside is that 20 years of satellite imagery means huge differences in quality, and as a result, well, you kind of have to take this with a fair amount of salt. What they've found is that, first of all, that let's say, the further north you are, or arguably south, the more that spring is delayed. That winter, particularly across essentially the Mediterranean level of the Earth, that is places like California, Chile, South Africa, even Southern Australia and the Mediterranean itself, tend to have much more wet and mild winters, and much more hot and dry summers. Now, at least in the case of South Australia, given the name, we can already tell this is going to be a very bad thing, because Australia likes to catch fire, and Australia likes to grow lots and lots of burnable things if the winter is mild and wet. If the summer is hot and dry, this just means you've created a whole bunch of kindling. The same thing is likely to apply in places like California that has a somewhat similar environment, to a lesser extent South Africa, but certainly not unreasonably so. Chile's certainly at risk, and the Mediterranean is, well, we've seen what's happening with Greece recently. Next we have a rather bloody news item. In fact, it's a blood moon, and it's a blood moon that'll last for 82 minutes, so verging on just under an hour and a half. Now, this is the perfect opportunity for you to get out your virgin sacrifices, the cult members, and try and summon some sort of eldritch god or old one. But assuming that you're not occupied with your particular cult activities and rituals, this will be an opportunity to not only be able to observe a giant blood moon that'll last for a very long time, but be kind of awesome, and if you possibly want to get photographs of said moon. The images itself, and certainly the moon itself, will be visible from Australia, Asia, and Europe, with America basically being ignored this time, barring Hawaii.
Oh, well, that was wonderful. Good time was had by all. I'm pooped.
Yes, I should be. Good Lord, what is happening in there?
Aurora Borealis?
Aurora Borealis. At this time of year, at this time of day, in this part of the country, localized entirely within your kitchen.
Yes.
May I see it?
No.
As a result, you basically get to see it if you're in parts of the world that aren't crazy. Well, no, aren't quite as crazy. Now, we should point out that depending on where in the world you are, you may see more or less of the said blood moon itself. Basically, if you were in the middle of the Indian Ocean, you would see everything, but as you shift east and west from there, you see gradually less, with those as far as more or less the extreme side of Iceland, or possibly arguably as far as, say, Ireland, about the extent of being able to see this. On the other side of it, New Zealand is perhaps on the extreme far end of being able to see this blood moon. So anywhere really in South America, North America, and most of Alaska are shit out of luck. Even further afield in terms of astronomy news, we have the powerful NSF NOAA Solar Telescope, giving us incredible images of the first X-class solar flare it's been able to record. The sun produces solar flares on a reasonably regular basis, and every 12 years or so it goes into extreme mode, and so we can finally get images of what's going on here. The images themselves aren't particularly important to the average person, but in the terms of the actual ability to record them, it is kind of amazing. And if you have the, let's say, wherewithal and certainly skills and knowledge to make use of it, this could prove to be an incredibly informative and incredibly powerful way to understand what's going on with the sun. The final news item we have for you is all about the interstellar comet 3I/Atlas, and the fact that it is getting not only to be more bizarre, but at least 4 powerful telescopes have agreed that it's behaving weirdly. Now, we should be clear about this. We are still not going to go as far as the History Channel and claim aliens.
I need an answer.
Take him out, Commander.
We are locked on.
I think this is a mistake. Let's take another moment.
Rather, we have NASA and European space agencies. Instruments Hubble, Sphere-X, James Webb Telescope, and TESS all have looked at it, and all have tried to understand what's going on. What they've noticed is that the weird object, Atlas, has been outgassing long before we spotted it, and this has led to it developing an atmosphere or a coma. And because of that, it has a relatively higher proportion of carbon dioxide than scientists would typically see, and it's key to say typically here, in comets, interstellar or otherwise. Now, this would tell us something about the environment in which Atlas formed. Arguably not quite the kind of history you have for Atlas in normal terms, that is, weird incestuous family relationships, but at least we know something about its history. What's important with this particular astronomical object is that, unlike just about every other object in space, it began showing activities further out, that is, at roughly 6 astronomical units, versus the standard 5 or less from the Sun, and so this means it's behaving differently. Differently is not the same thing as aliens did it, or something similar. In this case, the explanation is relatively simple, we've already touched on it. CO2 will sublimate and turn into a gas much more easily than regular water-based ice. As a result, if it is primarily carbon dioxide, well, that would explain just about everything. This would mean that the comet, when it was forming, was definitely on a planet that had a very high concentration of CO2. We should say protoplanet, but technicalities aside, it also means that possibly you could argue that there is a low water abundance both on that protoplanet and on this particular comet, which is why we see a massive amount of CO2 being gassed off or sublimated as it passes ever closer and then essentially by our Sun. Of course, all of this is only really speculation at the moment with relatively limited evidence for it, but between having limited evidence that it's a natural phenomena and speculation that is relatively wild that it's aliens, we'll go with the limited evidence. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.